In Discipline and Punish, or Punir et Surveiller, Michel Foucault describes the measures taken as per magisterial order in a French city ridden by the Black Plague sometime in the 17th century. There were armed guards guarding the town hall and the city gates, and at the end of every street. Every street was under the surveillance of a syndic. On the appointed day, everyone was ordered to stay indoors. The syndic locks the doors from the outside. He visits every house every day. He speaks to the people through the windows. If a person leaves the house or the syndic leaves the street, either of them may be sent to the gallows. The surveillance is based on a system of permanent registration, writes Foucault. Everything that may be observed during the course of the visits, deaths, illnesses, complaints, irregularities, is noted down and transmitted to the intendants and magistrates. The magistrates have complete control over medical treatment. They have appointed a physician in charge. No other practitioner may treat. No apothecary prepare medicine. No confessor visit a sick person without having received from the magistrate a written note. Says Foucault, inspection functions ceaselessly. Foucault notes that this surveillance divides the population into binary categories. There is the sick and the well, the dangerous and the harmless. At the same time, the collection of this personal data allows the authorities to individualize the disciplinary regime. Who is this person? How is he to be recognized? Where should he be? How should surveillance be exercised over him in an individual way? Foucault writes, the relationship of each individual to his disease passes through the representatives of power, the registration that they make, the decisions that they take on it, the constant division between the normal and the abnormal to which every individual is subjected brings us back to our time, when whole sets of techniques and institutions for measuring, supervising, and correcting the abnormal brings into play the disciplinary mechanisms to which the fear of the plague gave rise. And I have to say, I hear a little bit of that going on here. What is this fear? It's the fear of contagion, of course. It's the fear of punishment. In the plague city, either one of these could be fatal. But the panic induced by every plague, bubonic, HIV, sexual predators, is not just fear of a virus, it is fear of the other. When the contagion is everywhere, the fear stirs suspicion in everyone else, and perhaps the greatest fear is to be marked as the other. From the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, number 145.253, dated September 1st, 2015. Subject, Special Condition X, sex offender condition. Purpose, to establish X as a special condition of parole or mandatory supervision and to establish a procedure for imposing such as a condition of parole or mandatory supervision. What follows are a whole list of government criminal, procedural, and administrative codes and sections, articles, and policies, and then which departments and which agencies and which people and which individuals will be collaborating to minimize the threat of sex offenders to the community when an offender is released on parole or mandatory supervision. At any time Special Condition X is in effect, the offender shall fully comply with, and then there are 5 pages of conditions and requirements. The second condition, is sex offender registration. Under U.S. federal law, every person with a sex-related conviction must register with the law enforcement in his jurisdiction, where he lives, his name, his address, his photograph, and his fingerprints, and in some places his DNA. He has to report regularly to the authorities. He has to report if there's a change in any circumstance, a new car, enrollment in school, a job, or a change of address, even if he is homeless. Most registrants are also on the publicly accessible internet sex offender registry with their name, their photo, which is usually a mugshot, their physical description, and information about their conviction. Some states also publish the home addresses of the people on the registry, which has led to vandalism, arson, harassment of families, assaults, and even murder. Federal law sets the minimum term of sex offender registry at 15 years. It's often 25 years or life. And even when you're taken off, nothing ever dies on the internet. Registrable offenses, raiding a sex worker is called sex trafficking, HIV status non-disclosure. Along with reporting and the online registration, there are dozens and dozens of rules and restrictions as to where and with whom a sex offender may live, work, recreate, worship, or simply be. There are child safety zones. People have to stay away from parks, school buses, sports fields, any place a kid might be. In some places, this covers the entire jurisdiction, and there's nowhere for a former sex offender to live. And also, depending on where you live, a registered offender may be prohibited from volunteering at a polling place, getting a barber's license, or hanging out Halloween decorations. One's status is constantly on display. Back. Many states put sex offender or sexual predator on a license plate. Under international Megan's Law, which was signed by President Obama in 2016, the government must stamp on the passport of any former sex offender his status, and he must carry that at all times. The strange thing about this is it's all supposed to protect children. It doesn't protect children for numerous reasons. One is that most sexual violence against children, or all violence against children, happens not in the park and not at the school bus, but at home, by family members, boyfriends, so on. The other one is that there are many teens and minors who are on the sex offender registry. In fact, in the US, the peak age for involvement with the criminal legal system regarding sex-related offenses is 14. This is not because the streets are masked with 14-year-old rapists. It's because the age of consent in most states is 16, and in most places, 18. The paranoia that this regime circulates comes down on all adults. Sorry. No. This is many parks don't allow you in just to sit. And I think things like this arguably make children less safe. These policies collectively are called sex offender management. The surveillance is based on a system of permanent registration. Inspection functions ceaselessly. There are nearly 1 million people on the sex offender registry. This is a priest curing lepers. Or no, I guess they're people with bubonic plague. Registration is the second condition in the Texas Special Patrol Condition X. The first condition, which is what I'm going to talk about most, is that the offender must enroll and participate in a treatment program for sex offenders and submit to regular polygraph tests. Sex offender treatment is an intrinsic element of the sex offender registry and sex offender management. Like the registry, it is based on the notion that sex offending is a unique, incurable psychiatric disorder which must be perpetually kept under control lest it compel the person to strike again. Sex offending is not in the DSM. There is, in fact, no accepted psychological diagnosis for a person who commits rape. As many of you know, many of us may fantasize about rape, but would never think of raping somebody. The only symptom of the disorder of sex offending is having committed a sex offense. This also begs the question because there is no single criminal profile of people who commit sex offenses. People who commit sex offenses also commit other crimes, and people who commit other crimes also, often simply by convenience, commit a sex offense. You hold up a store, you might as well get a blowjob from the clerk. Sex offender treatment is not, even by its own definition, therapy. It is not an experience of emotional and psychological self-discovery, and it has nothing to do with sexual health or rights. It is called victim-centered. Its priority is the safety of the victim and the community, which often means the aggressive attack on the needs and rights of the offender, who's called an offender and never a patient or a client. Unlike therapy, sex offender treatment involves no trust or confidentiality. In fact, it's the opposite. Secrecy is the lifeblood of sexual offending, according to the Texas Council. Polygraph tests are universally used to check that the offender is telling the truth in treatment. Even though the results of polygraphy are not admissible in court because they're so unreliable. A sex offender back to prison. Failure to complete the treatment, which is up to the provider can also send somebody back to prison for as long as 25 years. The treatment usually consists of a kind of a cycle of rote exercises that are some version of cognitive behavior treatment. As in a medieval inquisition, the offender in treatment is required to repeat the details of his crime week after week. The stated goal is to identify triggers to prevent relapse, aka reoffense. Any sexual arousal can be a trigger. He has forbidden the use of pornography, which is seen as an addiction leading inevitably to violence. SOT condemns non-monogamy as a form of abusive behavior. Casual sex is categorically pathological and escape from the only proper function of sex, which is intimacy, coupling, and relationship. Kink, needless to say, is beyond the pale. Masturbation is discouraged, and masturbation to deviant fantasy must be confessed. Needless to say, there is no mention of pleasure. It's not confidential. The offender is forced to sign a consent form that anything he says can be shared with the police, the courts, the parole officer, the child welfare agencies. SOT is part of what is called the containment approach to sex offender management. This conspiracy of jailers and self-styled healers is referred to as multidisciplinary collaboration. In the Plague City, we saw the criminalization of illness. In sex offender treatment, we see the criminalization of deviance and the medicalization of crime. The conflation of the deviant and the criminal is seamless. Asked how she would define sexual deviance, a licensed sex offense provider told me, deviance is anything that is against the law. In Punir et Surveiller, Foucault wrote about two kinds of individuals, both real and symbolic. The plague victim, who's caught up in a meticulous tactical partitioning of places and people for the purpose of individual surveillance and control, and the leper, who is branded for exclusion and is left to his doom in a mass that is a mass of all lepers, among which it is useless to differentiate. These two subjects and the projects that are imposed on them, segmentation on one hand, the blurring of distinctions on the other, surveillance on one hand, abandonment on the other, merged in the 19th century in particular institutions, principally the psychiatric asylum, the penitentiary, and the reformatory. Today in the US, along with the 1 million people on the sex offender registry, there are 6,500 people detained infinitely in a gulag of psychiatric facilities. They're called patients or residents, but civil commitment is really like prison, with censorship, solitary confinement, lockdowns, raids. This incarceration is called civil commitment. The laws that allow such commitment they're not new, but they started in Washington State in 1990 in the heat of a panic about a woman who had been abducted, raped, and killed by a man who was out, a sex offender who was out on work release. The state could have tried the guy and put him back in prison, but the public was clamoring for a more efficient way to keep sex offenders locked up forever. And because the US Constitution, like most constitutions, does not permit preventive detention for criminal offenses, it does, however, allow the involuntary civil commitment in mental institutions of people whose illness makes them a danger to themselves or to others. So the Washington State Assembly invented a new psychopath, the sexually violent predator. The sexually violent predator, SVP, is a person who has been convicted or charged with a crime of sexual violence and who suffers from a mental abnormality or personal disorder which makes him likely to engage in predatory acts of sexual violence. The American Psychiatric Association condemned this diagnosis as vague and circular and the misuse of psychiatry to effect non-medical societal, by which they meant punitive, means. To be clear, the SVP is a person who 10 or 20 years previous was deemed perfectly sane in order to be tried, convicted, and put in prison. And now the state is allowed to change his mind and say that he's so crazy and so that he can never be released into the community. They always say it's for the worst of the worst, but I've met a lot of people in civil commitment. Some of them are the worst of the worst, like this guy in Washington. Others are autistic young people who have downloaded child pornography. There are many people who committed their offenses when they were youth, and there's evidence of a disproportion of gay men and of men of color. The treatment inside civil commitment is much like the treatment outside of it, except that it goes on forever, for days and days, for hours and hours a day. It's supposed to make somebody ready for the community, but because he's by definition not ready for the community because he's so dangerous, it goes on years and years and years. The person is climbing this escalator of repetitive sessions, almost seeing the top, and then he is sent back to a lower level to climb again for infractions such as failure to progress, and my favorite, treatment fatigue. Once you're inside this gulag, short of a miracle, this is Jesus curing the 10 lepers, and that's Krishna also curing a leper. A person is unlikely ever to leave. A lawsuit against the program, civil commitment program in Minnesota, found that in the 20 years of the program, not a single person had ever been released. Severe depression is epidemic in civil commitment. Suicide is not unusual. The only guaranteed way to get out is to die. It's a polygraph test. The goal of sex offender treatment is to reduce recidivism, but sex offenders already have the lowest rate of recidivism of virtually any criminal population. So research shows that treatment works, and I know there's going to be a panel about treatment to reduce recidivism, but also no treatment works to reduce recidivism because recidivism is already so low. One of the most interesting meta-studies on this was done looking at 10 years, meta-study of 10 years of models of risk of reoffense for people with records of sex offenses, people with non-sexual offense records, and people with no criminal record. And there was no difference. There's no significant difference among any of them. The researcher, who was Carl Hansen, who's the guy who's one of the authors of the Static 99, which is the principal assessment tool used to determine how long a person's sentence is going to be, what his parole conditions will be, how high a risk he is of reoffending, and also whether he can go into civil commitment. So Carl Hansen himself, who's based his instrument on the idea that having committed sex offenses has a lot to say about whether you're going to commit them again, said that after 10 years, people change, desistance is the norm, with or without treatment. So the problem's not therapy. The problem, probably everybody in this room could benefit from therapy. I know I did. The problem is that this idea that sex is a separate category of the human psyche, a separate category of life, and that sex offending is a special psychopathology that needs a special kind of treatment. Furthermore, there are a few good practitioners, but sexual offense treatment is mostly the opposite of therapeutic. It is coercive, humiliating, punitive, and moralistic. It is a form of control, not of treatment or cure. This is the zombie apocalypse, for those of you who are zombie fans. Whenever you see a demonstration of someone like setting themselves on fire or jumping out of an airplane without a parachute, they always say, don't try this at home. Many of you in this room are coming from countries who are trying this at home. Since the U.S.'s first federal sex offense legislation in 1994, 29 other countries on every continent have enacted some form of sex offender registration. As of last year, another 16 were considering it. The Congress of Europe and the Council of the EU encourage member states to consider implementing sex offender registries in their countries consistent with national constitutional principles. Intelpro, Europol, and the EU share information on travelers' sex offense status, and so do the 22 countries under the Schengen Agreement. And as probably many of you know, am I doing this wrong? Oh, there it is. As of 2018, 32 US states and 68 countries in some way criminalize the non-disclosure of HIV status, even if the seropositive partner wears a condom, is on ARVs, or does not transmit the virus. Many countries are raising their ages of consent, which leads to more statutory rape prosecutions, stealthing, which is taking off a condom surreptitiously during sex, revenge porn, which is posting, non-consensually posting erotic pictures of somebody online. There's something called dating deception, which is lying on dating sites, something that research shows 80% of people do. And then, for instance, following Me Too, there was a French law passed against catcalling, that the police could arrest somebody on the street who catcalled, and I think we all know who's going to be arrested and who's not by the French police. This doesn't happen just in theocratic or authoritarian governments. It happens in democracies such as France. And along with these new laws comes the medicalization of sex crime, which is, so the Association of Treatment of Sex Abusers, or ATSA, is based in the US. It has 3,000 members from 20 countries. There's also an International Association for the Treatment of Sexual Offenders, IATSO, in Germany. In some places, the existence of sex offender registries goes along with other repressive laws, such as crackdowns on adultery, homosexuality, or gender nonconformity, but not always. Many of the same jurisdictions that criminalize HIV non-disclosure, for instance, also legalize same-sex marriage. So the distinctions between the sick and the well, the deviant and the normal, the dangerous and the harmless, are historical, cultural, and always changing. Why am I talking to you about this stuff in a conference about pleasure? And why am I talking to you about it? I have been a sex, as Ellen knows, a pro-sex feminist from the very beginning, a pleasure activist and unapologetic veteran of the sexual revolution. To me, freedom, happiness, and fun are the reason to have social movements, progressive social movements. I care about economic justice and I care about equality, but like Emma Goldman, I don't want to be part of any revolution that I can't dance to, which I always interpreted as meaning I can't fuck to. I used to be in a group called No More Nice Girls. We would go around in the street with signs that said sex for fun. But beginning in the 1980s, as Anne Philpott talked about, we began to talk about danger all the time. For conservatives, the danger. For us, the danger was the virus. For conservatives, the danger was not the virus, but the people who were being killed by the virus, dying from the virus. And a sex panic was developing. Sure enough, the sex panic was about protecting children from promiscuity, from homosexuality, the homosexual agenda, from so-called sexual predators. Also in 1981, just as the first gay men were dying from HIV, we started hearing rumors of bizarre sexual aggressions against toddlers in daycare centers, being raped with spoons and forks, being flown to Mexico to be, abused by clowns, the dismemberment of animals. And hundreds of people were convicted of these crimes and went to prison. Hundreds of people went to prison over these insane, bizarre ideas. So two discourses began to develop. There were the pleasure people over here, and there were the violence people over there. The feminist anti-violence movement became, in the mid-'80s, ridiculously, completely obsessed with pornography, as if dirty pictures were the main threat to women. Later, the anti-porn movement was sort of defeated, and it became the anti-trafficking movement, which in many cases means the anti-sex worker rights movement. And while we were out there with our signs, sex for fun, the anti-violence feminists joined more and more with social and law and order conservatives to develop what we call now carceral feminism. And that is a feminism that fits with the logic of the punitive state, that how should we deal with sexual violence? We should punish it. We should police it, and we should punish it, and we should punish it more and more and more. So then there were the sex surrogates and therapists conferences over here, and there were the sex abuse and trauma therapists over there at a different conference. In 2002, I was tired of all this abuse and trauma talk, and I wrote the book that Alain mentioned, Harmful to Minors. about the sexual rights of children and youth. And when I ventured that the world was not full of pedophiles, I was crucified as an advocate of pedophilia. I was even called a pedophile myself. And my publisher suppressed the book, but it got out anyway, and I began to get letters in prison from people who were convicted of sex offenses and from their families, people on the registry and so on. So the sex panic was still raging, and this regime I'm talking about was its legacy, is its legacy. And it's not just bad for sex offenders, it is a model for all of the harsh treatment of everyone else who comes under the control of the prison industrial system. And like that system, it hits the poor most, it hits Black and marginalized communities, it hits trans people of color, people who work in the sex economy on the street. So it is part of the unjust sexual criminal justice system. So I cared about these guys who were writing to me, and I felt they were being done a great injustice, but I was also disturbed by their almost universally minimizing the harm that they had done. They were victimized by the state. They had often been victimized in their own childhoods, but prison and treatment was only making them worse. It was exacerbating the same sort of lack of empathy, persecution complex, infantile self-image that allowed them to do the harm in the first place. So then there became another split conversation, the people representing victims' rights who didn't care about the injustice of the criminal justice system, and then the people who were worried about the criminal justice system didn't care all that much about interpersonal violence, and everybody hated sex offenders. White women were in the anti-violence movement fighting for more prison, and women of color were saying that the cops have never been our friends, our communities have been destroyed by this stuff, we need some other way to do it. What these women of color were telling us is that interpersonal violence and state violence are not like opposite moral actors. They're the same. They have the same ideology that might makes right. This is why sexual violence is the highest, it's the most prevalent in places that are misogynist, that are homophobic, that are racist, that are authoritarian, that have male gods, that are theocratic, that have great economic equality, especially between the sexes, and that stress the differences between the sexes and that prohibit abortion, all the rest of it, that tell children to obey but don't really care about whether they're in poverty or they have poor health or poor education. So to oppose one kind of violence is to oppose the other. By the same token, communities like ours that value mutuality and mutual aid, self-protection and communication and equality, and have less violence, we can learn from those communities like the BDSM community, AIDS crisis community, to change and to resist those kinds of violent mores. So finally, feminists of color came together and began to do some practices. One is called Restorative Justice. I don't know if any of you know about it. It's a practice that brings harm doing back into relationship, back into the community, in which the person who does harm and the person who has been done harm are able to have a dialogue, and the person who's done harm is really held to account. There's an attempt to figure out how to repair the harm, and then there is an effort to bring that person, the harm doer, back into the community under the principle that we have all done bad things and we shouldn't pay for it forever. But it's also transformative justice adds politics to that, and it says that harm doesn't just happen out of context, it happens in a social, economic context, and we need to approach to confront those conditions that make harm possible in the first place. As Foucault showed us, the criminalization of deviance and the medicalization of crime have been around a long time. They've been linked always to racialized medical and social science, and not infrequently to eugenic campaigns. Authoritarian governments have long used psychiatric diagnosis as a weapon against political enemies, as, for instance, the Soviet dissidents diagnosed with what the Stalinists called sluggish schizophrenia were sent to what were openly called psychiatric prison hospitals. The Sex Offender Registry and the sex offender treatment are the latest examples of all of this. The criminalization of illness, the medicalization of crime, and the politicization of sexual deviance, because there's no better way to get a vote than to figure out some novel way of making life miserable for a sex offender. This all makes sense because the body is the body, But body and sex are political, they're social, they're cultural, they're historical, and they're moral, and they take place outside, not just in couples, but in the world, in communities. We will not end sexual violence, and we will not create a world where pleasure is every person's right, either with punishment or with repressive cures. That is cultural work, educational work, and political work. But in Carol Vance's perfect coinage about sex and danger, about pleasure and danger, sexuality, women's sexuality, the sexuality of minorities, of gender nonconforming people, is a dialectic of pleasure and danger. Any movement, said Carol, that focuses on only one is destined to fail. Thank you.